Hello, and thanks for joining me today. My name is Jeff, and you're listening to episode 25 of the Comic Book of the Day podcast. Hello, welcome back to another edition of the Comic Book of the Day podcast. My name is Jeff. Today's comic is a war comic, and this one is published by Charlton Comics Group. This is published on or around November of 1964, and this is Marine War Heroes number 5, published again, like I said, by Charlton Comics. This was an interesting book. I think if I remember correctly, how I acquired all of this was that I acquired a big, I don't know if I would call it a big stack, but maybe a couple of an inch or two stack of old Charlton comic books, and it was really just sort of curiosity more so than anything. They had Charlton I think Charlton was founded around the mid 40s. It was named after the publishers, the founder, Santangelo Sr. and Ed Levy. But it was founded by it was originally named the TWO Charles Company, and after the co-founders' two sons, which were both named Charles, it became Charlton Publications. Now, this was interesting. Charlton Publications was one of the first companies that sort of owned soup to nuts the entire comic book process. It's interesting. I remember, I don't know how many of you collected comics in, say, the 90s or maybe the 80s. I don't know how old you people are out there in the audience, but sometime around the 90s, Diamond Comics distributors sort of sewed up all of the market. It wasn't always the case. There was, at the time there were a handful of comics distributors, some distributing underground comics and so on and so forth. But there was a comic book distribution company called Capital Distribution, and they were actually owned by Charlton Comics. They were Charlton Publications, actually. They owned the printing, they owned the writing, they owned all of that themselves, which was kind of interesting, right? I mean, they owned the art, they owned the printing, they did their own printing. In other words, they didn't go out for, they didn't go to like Donnelly or a larger printer for printing. So they owned the printing, they owned the creation, and then they owned the distribution. So they were really pretty much in charge of the entire soup to nuts deal there with comics. They published Steve Ditko. They published Captain Atom. That was one of the ones, I think probably the first Charlton comic that I got my hands on, where I recognized that, this wasn't DC and this wasn't Marvel. It was a Ditko book. It was Ditko's Captain Atom, and I believe that started. That might have been published somewhere around the mid 50s, I think. But I think it was around maybe late 50s when Captain Atom came around, and I believe Captain Atom's first stories appeared in a book called Space Adventures. Now I've got a handful of old Charlton Space Adventures, but I don't have any Space Adventures that feature Captain Atom. And then later, in the mid-60s, Captain Atom was part of a comic book called Strange Suspense Stories. I have a couple of strange suspense stories from the 60s that are basically just Captain Atom on the masthead, where it says up at the top of the comic, it says Strange Suspense Stories presents Captain Atom. So glance at the comic book, it looks like the title of the book is Captain Atom, but it's actually a Strange Suspense Stories. And then they had reprinted some of those. But man, these guys, Charlton Comics, I think the one thing that I remember most of all about Charlton Comics was that they were the kingpin war comics publishers. I mean, they published like pretty much doggone every kind of war comic that you could get your hands on. They had a line of books called Fightin', Fightin' with the G gone, so it was Fightin' with an N and apostrophe. They had Fightin' Air Force, Fightin' Army, Fightin' Marines, and Fightin' Navy. I've got a handful of the Fightin' Navy books, of course. I mean, I'm a sailor. I collect, ex-sailor, so I collect a lot of Navy war comics and stuff. Just kind of my gig. If I'm looking for war comics, I'm looking for Navy. And then they had like an attack line. So they had like different lines. They had the fighting line, and then they had the attack line. They had Army Attack, Submarine Attack. They had a book called Battlefield Action, a book about D-Day, U.S. Air Force comics, and then War Heroes, which we talked about previously. We had talked about the issue of War Heroes that featured John F. Kennedy and PT-109 a few days ago. But they were anthology books, right? So they had they weren't necessarily they weren't like Sergeant Rock or Sergeant Fury. They were just anthology stories. I don't know, like, how do you, not really featuring a character, but featuring, a handful of individual stories of heroism, right? So it wasn't necessarily that they had any sort of standout character, but you would get individual stories of valor and freedom, and maybe they would. Maybe they would have some recurring characters. I think one of the ones that they had was the Devil's Brigade was one, and then they had the Captain Willie Schultz was another one. So everybody, I think at one time or another, everybody wanted to have some sort of proprietary. I don't know, proprietary is not really the word, but they wanted to have a character, like a recurring character in some war comics. Sergeant Rock, the same way that DC had Sergeant Rock and Marvel Comics had Sergeant Fury. But yeah, so Charlton Comics, they're pretty cool. I mean, this is the place where Dick Giordano got his start. They had this is where the Blue Beetle, if you remember the Blue Beetle, and Captain Atom from the Justice League is the Charlton Captain Atom, and Blue Beetle came from Charlton as well. At one point, DC Comics would get a hold of, they were acquired, I think, in the mid '80s. Most of the characters by DC Comics. I mean, that was the Dick Giordano connection, right? So the action heroes, they were originally, here's an interesting, I'm sure probably most of you already knew this, but the Charlton characters that DC got their hands on, they had purchased in 1983, I think it was, 84, and they were, DC was planning to do something with them, right? So Alan Moore had found out that, had discovered that DC had these characters. And so Alan Moore had written a story featuring Captain Atom and the Blue Beetle and a couple of the other Charlton superheroes. And it, at a certain point, I think somebody over at DC got the heebie-jeebies about using those characters and decided that they didn't want Moore's story to take place using the Charlton character, so he substituted out the Owl and the rest of the characters that eventually became the Watchmen. But if you look at the Watchmen, it's you'd have to be almost brain dead not to realize that those were the Charlton Comics characters. But the Question was one, Blue Beetle, Captain Atom. Those are all that's all the Watchmen. But then DC, I think at one time decided that they wanted to use these, and of course, Blue Beetle and Captain Atom were introduced in the Justice League of America, and then of course, The Question had a couple of Vertigo titles to his name, so that's what eventually became of the Charlton Comics group. But I think for the most part, there's a heyday there in the Silver Age where you get to see a lot of Charlton Comics, war comics. It's fighting Air Force, fighting Marines, fighting Navy, and this is no different. This is tales of heroism of the United States Marine Corps. 5 stories in this book. I think there's 5, maybe 6 stories in there. I think Just One PFC is written by Joe Gill. The Organizer, another story by Joe Gill. Happy Birthday, Marine Intelligence, The Bridge at Fortville, and Don't Leave Me Here to Die. So this one, there's one of these stories. The Don't Leave Me Here to Die is an old Korean War story. A couple of Korean War stories. There's a World War I story, and there's just the rest of them are sort of like your generic World War II stories, but they're all stories of the Marines, the United States Marines, right? So, but this is a great, if you were a fan of the Marine Corps, or if your dad was in the Marines, I'm sure at a certain time, I'm sure all boys went through, some sort of phase where they were either into the Marines, or they were into Air Force, or they were into airplanes, or they were big fans of tanks, or they liked aircraft carriers, or they liked jets, or machine guns. I think there's something about war that kids, little boys especially, will just sort of gravitate to. You give a kid a stick and he's going to turn it into a gun and run around and play cowboys and Indians, or play war, play good guys and bad guys. So I think, of course, these books captivate your imagination when you're a kid. So it's kind of hard to go through your childhood and not get caught up in these, at least at some point in your childhood. So, but this is a great little book. If you head over to comicbookoftheday.com, you can catch a look at this and see what it looks like. It's a cool little cover. I dig the cover. The interiors are pretty cool. The stories are nice and tight. 3, 4, 5-page stories. You get a little anthology book. It's a nice little collection of war stories. So check it out. Head over to comicbookoftheday.com and give it a look-see and see what you think. You can also follow along on Facebook at Comic Book of the Day. We're on Instagram as well. But yeah, if you want to subscribe, we would love to have you subscribe and follow along on iTunes or Google Play if you'd like to get this in your inbox every morning, or get this, wake up every day to a new comic book of the day. Hopefully you've enjoyed these little conversations, and we really enjoy having you listen for 10, 15 minutes a day. So yeah, if you enjoy it, subscribe, look us up, give us a shout out. We love and appreciate all the feedback that we get. If you like the show, let us know. And until then, this is Comic Book of the Day, and we will see you tomorrow.